Thank you very much, Eugene. And great to be here in South Africa. First time since 1992. So it's not absolutely my first visit. Then I came to buy a motorbike. I rode the motorbike up to Zambia and anticipated using it till it broke and then leaving it. But instead, I didn't go back to Zambia. Still, you may ask, why buy a motorbike so that it breaks? Well, there's a problem. If a missionary doesn't have a vehicle, then people think, well, what a useless missionary doesn't even have a vehicle. So it's maybe better to have a vehicle that's broken than no vehicle. But if you have a vehicle that works, you'll be an ambulance driver. Should missionaries be ambulance drivers? Fair enough, it's not a discussion time, but I think it's an apt question. To be an ambulance driver is excellent because you help a lot of sick people by taking them where they can get assistance. You can save lives. And then you have no time for any other language learning, any other ministry, and you're performing a role that, quite frankly, a national should perform. So, better not have a vehicle. Anyway, I want to talk about vulnerability as a preference for a missionary, a Western missionary. I was called to Zambia. Well, I was called to mission in 1987. Went to Zambia. They had forgotten that I was coming. No house. So they said, oh, there's someone there, a Zambian, in a big house, alone, at the secondary school I was to teach in, where I taught for 3 years. Put him there. So my colleagues swept out the room, there were mosquitoes, and I lived there with him. African colleague called Goliath. Because I was living with him, we used to walk different places. It was very difficult walking with Goliath, because Goliath walked like this, and I like to walk like this. But I had to force myself to really walk slowly to keep down with Goliath, so we could talk. And one thing I noticed after a few months was that Goliath tended to avoid being with a lot of white people. When we went to white people, he would excuse himself and leave when we'd finished eating. So I'd ask him, why do you avoid white people? He said, Jim, when my people see me with a white person, they know I'm after their money. So my associating with white people, these are my words, not his, but ruins my reputation amongst my own people. It makes them think I'm just greedy. So I tried to avoid them as much as possible. And I thought, wow, I'm one of those white people. Do I want, every time I go to a black African, to ruin their reputation? Well, no, I don't. So I must not have money to give out in order to make friends of people without spoiling them. When I was in Zambia, it was very striking that a white person should not live with a Zambian. Now, by mistake, I was put in a house with a Zambian, but I did think, why? Is it impossible? I remember in Tanzania with a colleague, and we were traveling, the two of us, and there was a guest house and a room with 2 beds, and he said, Jim, can I sleep together in a room with a white man? And I said, well, yes. But anyway, I thought, someone needs to try this, living with the Africans, not living over there and serving them, but living with them. So that's what I've tried ever since. Things to remember, I mean, we shouldn't forget that missionaries are dead. You must be dead. Now, if you're not sure about that, ask yourself why you were baptized. We are dead, and we have to be. In about 2002, by this time in Kenya, where I was active in an extension Bible teaching program, I was trying to work out, why were people always deceiving me? Because my African colleagues always seemed to say things that weren't true. I will come and see you tomorrow. This will work. We should do this, and then it'll be like this. So, before saying, well, they are devilish, I thought, let's just look a little bit at language. So I found a library and picked up a book on semantics, because I knew language was semantics. Words had meanings. And in this book it said, well, it's true that words mean things if what the words mean are true. It's true that the grass is green, if you say the grass is green, if the grass is green. Now, this is what they were saying. So I thought, oh, words don't mean things. Maybe what does mean things, I asked, and actually words in contexts mean things. So me, as a Brit, hearing my Kenyan colleagues speak, they were telling me untruths. They were deceiving me. But if I could hear them in the way they related their words to their context, then they were telling the truth. Now, at that time, well, I use Luo and Swahili languages, and I don't use English in East Africa, because English is, to me, a big problem. So, by realizing that, I came to realize I just need to use African languages. And in fact, once you start to use an African language, you have to use it with everybody. Because if, say, there was a group of people like this, and I went to, and I'm not remembering the names very well, my sister here, and she looks intelligent, I speak to her in English, and then I go to my brother here, and he doesn't look intelligent, I speak to him in Luo, I'm judging. So I have to speak to everybody in Luo and Swahili, because English in Kenya is a language of intelligence. So I have to avoid it so as not to judge people. When I was still in Zambia, I was teaching agriculture and very interested in having agricultural projects. When I looked around, when I talked to people, they would say, Jim, that's a very good idea. I think we should use fertilizer the way you are saying. And other projects as well. And then I realized that all the projects I could propose that I knew were going to work required me to bring money to make the project work. And then I also realized that if I was going to provide money to make the project work, people were going to say, yes, we want this project. So how do I know the project that people actually believe is going to work? I don't. The only way to be clear that this project is what people want is to not offer any money with it. But I found out in due course in Kenya that if the missionary doesn't have any money for their project, the people may not be very interested at all. Though, of course, when they first see you, and you have no color like me, they believe you have a lot of money, and they say wonderful things. Oh, we really love God's word. We want to learn God's word with you. And I've done this happened again and again over 18 years. And then a month or two later, the person misses a week and misses another week. And then he says, well, You can't expect me to come to learn the Bible and you're not giving me any money. So in order to interact with people on the level with open ears and open eyes, the missionary must not have money to give out or to use in their key ministry. That Bible extension, Bible teaching program ran for 18 years until 2011. Then I allowed it to collapse by then realizing that my theology really wasn't going to make sense to people anyway. Because let's say, it seems to me, a lot of the African people I work with, and I'm not familiar with South Africa, but they don't have a world view, they have a world feel. And that's quite profound. They feel their way into the world, and actually it makes a lot of sense, because feelings are a lot more important than views. But I was assuming that they were viewing the world rather than feeling it. So instead of opening classes and inviting people to them, I concentrated much more from 2011 on going to gatherings that people called themselves. So fellowships, typically church meetings, services, ceremonies. I would just show up. I wouldn't tell them I was coming, because if I told them I was coming, then I was making out I'm important. And maybe they'll say, hey, there's a white man coming. What do we have to do? Does he eat nshima? And so on. So I just show up, participate. If they want me to share God's word, which maybe 50 to 70% of the time they do, I'm very glad for that opportunity, and I use the Luo Swahili to share God's word. If I don't, well, it doesn't matter. So my message is oriented to people of a Western mindset. I'm here speaking English. Marcus and I have worked together a lot, and I said, I'm not coming to South Africa because I have to use English. Eventually, through circumstances, I've come. And another thing I can say that I don't agree with is the opposition in academic circles to generalization. I think that also is a very problematic power grab by Western nations. So there's my introduction. I continue to live in the same African village in Kenya after 31 years. I look after orphan children at home, and I'm very grateful to God for having given me this opportunity to actually live in an African village, in an African way, using African languages, eating the local food, and behaving in many ways like another villager. So the title that we've already read out, The Role of Western People in Theological Education for Africa Today, an Appeal for Vulnerability. What do you have to do to be able to understand sufficiently so as to communicate theology that connects with African people? Well, you have to minister to them using their own languages, because talking is a part of learning, and interaction is learning at depth. Anthropologists say participant observation, and that ability then that you acquire to hear people when they're talking enables you to begin to get a grasp, a depth of what's happening in the community. And theology is deep. Theology isn't teaching someone how to use a water pump, you know. It requires deep investment. I also believe that yes, I am my brother's keeper. These days, when it comes to Africa, it seems to me the West says, okay, we'll have the African talk to us in English. That's sufficient. They don't want to listen, now I don't know if you share this experience very often, to the white man talking about Africa. That's a colonial oppressor. They want to hear the African talking about Africa. Now, I'm not going to look at that into detail, but it's very problematic to hear an African who's learned English in school telling you about things that English can't articulate without knowing in depth the language that you're using in your Western community. So, I believe we are our brother's keeper, and we do not say, well, Africans give up on them. we as believers in Jesus, not, how do you put it? We're not responsible. Owe one another nothing but love. We need to love our African brothers and sisters, and that requires understanding. What's the difference in Europe? Increasingly, I've found that we do something quite peculiar as European people. We divide. This is material and physical, and this is godly and spiritual. Dualism. Now, I saw this way back in Zambia. Every time I worked with a lot of Americans, an American would discuss an issue, he'd discuss it like this, and when a Zambian would discuss an issue, he'd discuss it like that. And it was so different, and no one seemed to notice. And no one seemed to take any account of this. And I couldn't believe it. But there it was. And when I tried to say, well, what about this? People weren't really understanding. So dualism or non-dualism is ignored. And we put everyone through the same sausage machine called education. If you have a Bible college and the course is oriented to helping maybe British people to work in Africa, the African person joins the same class. Now, the class presupposes that people are dualistic. I don't think you can teach someone to be dualistic in a class. If we have a class here, this is how to be dualistic, it won't work. Dualism is what you presuppose when you come to education, not what you learn in education. And if you don't have dualism to presuppose, you use monism. And that will affect, or non-dualism, that will orient or impact on the way you receive that education. In effect, it will be a different education because it will be guided by a different logic. And every class you receive will be otherwise. Now, where does that come from? Well, one thesis is that it was the distinction between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church understands God through his essence and through his energies. And the energies of God are those parts of God that impact directly in the physical world or through the physical world. So for the East, God in his essence, God in his energies are one. But the West decided, according to certain authors, this is a theory rather than a conclusion, but there it is, that when the West said, God, we want to know God in his essence, so they kind of put the world aside in order to discover who God really is in his essence. They brought a separation. God in his essence, ineffable, and then there's a world. And this separation now affects us Western Europeans and those who come from Western Europe constantly and deeply. And it's become who we are. Theological origins, theological solutions, but not theology even you can learn in a class. This has to be a theology, seems to me, of a community. It means that when you use English, English works, functions, if the person interpreting it is dualistic in their thinking. It's like dualism is a key to getting it. If you're a non-dualist, English won't work for you. Now, that means that African communities, in order to function, have to have white people in charge. Because their non-dualistic thinking doesn't produce economic productivity, it forces them to learn English in order to thrive. In the process, no, I've lost them. They learn English in order to thrive. And then, yes, when they do that, we say, oh, you know English, I'll give you a job. Because English isn't evaluated according to someone's capability of performing, it's evaluated according to someone's capability at expressing. Now, if you do an English exam, it won't say, go and dig the garden, or it won't say, set up a business, it will say, well, how do you write? English is a grammatical system, yes, but what isn't examined is English as a pragmatic system. And that is dragging the globe into learning and using a language because we reward them when they use it like we do, that isn't going to help them, but that creates a lot of dependency. This has made it very difficult for a Westerner to learn African languages, certainly in the context I know. In Kenya, you go to a community and you say, habari yako ningependa kujua Kiswahili? People answer you in English. And this frustrates missionaries. Who's at fault? Well, we gave them English and subsidized it. I mean, books come. If you want to teach English, books come galore. You get all kinds of support systems. You have your school built for you. You try setting up a school in Luo, which we did for 18 years. This extension school ran in Luo and Swahili. No support. In fact, of course, what happened, there was an English language Bible school down the road, and all the students, oh, this is where the money is, the prestige is. They don't get to understand God in their community there, but the prestige and the incentives and the rewards are there. So, theological education in Africa should be in an African language. And then people say, which language? Because there are 2,000 languages in Africa. And the answer is, choose one. Choose one and run with it. Now, what happens if I come, presumably, to South Africa and certainly to Kenya, and I start a theological school using, let's say, the Luo language of Kenya. And I put up a building, an administration block. Then the neighboring tribe says, this fellow is teaching these people, they're going to get money. We're going to complain. You can't teach them in Luo because I don't know Luo, and I want to know God's word as well. So then you say, we have to use English because we want everybody to come to our class. What error have you made? The error you have made is bringing the gospel with money. Because if you want to teach people in Luo and you have no money, then the neighboring tribe doesn't care. But if you teach people in Luo, and these people who teach using the Luo language become wealthy, others will be envious. And if you're not aware of it, language is terrible. But what is often called witchcraft is rooted in envy. So witchcraft starts happening, and you will be forced to use English. So theological education programs in Africa must be in an African language and must not bring in resources from outside of Africa. So if you go and teach, you walk into the class and you teach, and one student tells you his grandmother's about to die, another student tells you they need school fees, another student tells me their house is leaking, please give them money. I don't have your money, and you go away again. Are we there to buy our students, or are we there to teach our students where they are? Then, I think we who are here, we believe that God's word transforms. And those people you teach, when God transforms them, not because you brought money, which creates the prosperity gospel, and let's just blame Pentecostals for the prosperity gospel. I think that, I don't want to point fingers, Reformed, whatever. People who come with the money, with the gospel and give money to people who are poor, they're generating prosperity gospel. So, they won't see the people having a lot of money, but they'll see something changes in their hearts. And when the neighboring tribe sees this tribe, their hearts being changed, they will want to know more. And some of them will know this language, and they'll come and listen and tell their own people. They will translate to their own people what you've told this people in this language, in a way that makes sense to them, not that is designed to attract foreign money. So a missionary should try to be as ignored as possible. As I say, it takes a long time, because when, in my experience, an African person sees me, they see money and they see English. So I like to be with the people who know me, and I've been there in this one village 30 years. People see me and they don't take any notice, and it's kind of wonderful. I can show up at a church and, yeah, okay, they're friendly, I'm not saying they're not friendly, but I don't have to be told to preach in case, men need to, if a man goes to a church and isn't told to preach, he won't come back with his money. So a missionary who comes has money has to be told to preach. But if you don't have money anyway, you don't have to preach. So the not having money eventually puts you in a position where you're no longer someone so special. How do you teach to learn? How do you learn, to teach African theology? Let's say you learn tacitly. I don't think there's lessons you can, I'm sure there are, but when you move to a different community, like I'm already finding here in South Africa, there are things I should know that I don't. So if I was to stay with you for a few months, I would have to change my ways. And that's what happens when you go to an African community. You start saying this, and then people look at you blankly, so you try saying that. And then you listen to the African preach, and you say, oh, goodness, is that what he's saying? Can I say that? And gradually you shift. Not in a think tank in Washington, but in God's Spirit using your mind to begin to reach the African people where they are. And of course, the faith counts as much as the words, or more than the words. Now, it depends what you're communicating with your faith, because people do realize, if you come as a young person to Africa and you do 10 years and then you go back to, classically, the US, you become a professor of missions in a big university, where they think, he came to us to do his 10 years so that, what? He could be a professor and earn a lot of money in a big university. So I say you have to grow old there until people are convinced you're actually not trying to make money out of us. And then your witness perhaps begins to be a Christian witness and not, well, he's like everybody else trying to make money. And we're the ones he's making money out of. And of course, if you want to make money out of African people, they expect a share. If you want them to cooperate, you have to give them something. Otherwise, that's just plain unfair. So how can we demonstrate that we're not there to make money? Connecting with the indigenous, I think you have to live a divided life. Now, that may sound terrible, but what I mean is you have to divide your Western way of life and keep it aside so that you can connect with African people without disrupting everything they're doing by trying to use what some call integrity. If integrity is keeping your whole life in a whole, treating everybody the same, whether they're your child, who's an American child, or their child, who's an African child, you will spoil a great deal. Which is related to why I've long said, if a typical missionary moved into a neighboring village, then I would have to tell the children I look after, who are African children, don't make friends with that missionary, because that will bring us problems. And hence, in my own looking after of those children, I don't use English. If I was to use English at home, they would all be number one in their class, because I have British English, which is official English in Kenya, and nobody else does. Now, if the orphan children I bring in get to be number one in their class, envy will destroy us. People will pay a lot of money to anyone who can influence me to take their child, so they go to university and go and study in America. We must not use English in Africa, and here I am in South Africa using English. Well, 2 minutes left. Okay. We must be ready to refuse local people's advice if local people tell us either we need your money or we need you to use English. Problem solving, if you find someone with malaria, or at least you suspect it's malaria. If in the UK I find someone who's sick, I know the solution and I don't give it, I may be acting illegally. But if we're going to problem solve in Africa, we will problem create. We need to give our lives in service, not a 5-year term. So I'm saying all this, suggesting that some Western missionaries should do vulnerable mission, use local languages, use local resources, which for some, which is my case, may require celibacy. Generosity, I find, in the way it's talked about in mission, is often an excuse to live a Western way of life in an African community. I do just wish, hope, request that African people value their languages so that a missionary can be enabled to learn them, and that we can do theological education on the basis of understanding and not simply assumptions that we know the answers, when actually, when translated into African languages, now of course, when African people use English, they're reflections of their own language. So even if you're translating into English, the categories are wrong and it doesn't really work. Thank you very much indeed. God bless.